Can you imagine a worse story for a sermon about peace? Think through your mind of all the stories you know from the scriptures. Jacob and Esau, brothers fighting before they were even born, according to legend. Twins, one grabbing the other's heel, fighting for who will be the first out. Isaac and Rebekah, spouses in a complete failure of communication and partnership. Siblings competing, parents playing favorites. Oh, let's talk about peace. If we want a story about respecting others, this is not a good one. If we want a story about good communication, this is the wrong story. If we want a story about peace, well, it depends on what you mean by peace. If peace is agreement, if peace is submitting to the will of those around you, if peace is what we want a story about, peace where everybody feels peaceful, then I'm not sure there is a good story for that. Let's be honest. That kind of peace where everybody gets along and there is no problem, no conflict, it's not real and it's rarely really peace. The absence of conflict is not peace. The absence of conflict is not peace. It's often fiction or the work of a dictator. It's often fantasy or the result of abuse. It's often avoidance or the repression of feelings, an avoidance and an inability to have free speech. An absence of conflict is not peace. Peace, true peace, comes from dealing with conflict. It comes through the conflict in a way that reflects love, that shows compassion and respects everyone. Peace, true peace, comes through the conflict, without hiding it, without ignoring it, and without avoiding it. So for a sermon on peace, true peace, maybe this is the perfect story. It's a story that begins with conflict, as we've said, before the brothers are born. The mother says they were fighting in her womb. My wife swears both our kids were fighting in the womb, and there was only one at a time. They were just jumping a lot. Mothers feel that way, but this one, by legend, was a historically difficult pregnancy, with these two grasping for one another all throughout. They grow up. There's stories of the two of them trying to mess with each other all along. Jacob trying to one-up Esau from the beginning with a massive second child inferiority complex all along the way. And then it erupts. The story erupts in the story that we hear today, the one that Jesse read, with Rebekah setting Jacob against his father to receive the blessing. Now, this story doesn't end here. It continues for chapters of Genesis. It goes on and on. At this point, Esau comes home. Jacob goes, uh-oh, he's bigger than me still. I may be blessed, but he can still kick my butt. So he takes off out of there. Esau stays at home, it seems, for a while, but then leaves and forges his own life. Jacob continues seeking a blessing, still feeling inadequate, like his blessing was stolen or something. Always seeking a blessing of his own. We get the story of Jacob and Jacob's ladder, him seeking something more, trying to sort through the events of his life, wanting this connection with God, with others, but really to believe in himself. Along the way, he meets a man named Laban and gets tricked into marrying the wrong daughter, and then finally works longer and ends up with both of Laban's daughters as wives. The beginning of the tribes of Israel between Jacob and these women. But along the way, he still feels inadequate. And on the horizon is a reunion with his brother Esau. At one point in the story, Jacob sends his wives and his children, which he has many of, out in front of him along with the livestock to where Esau's coming their way. And he goes, and on a faithful night that we hear the scripture story of very often, he has a dream where he wrestles with an angel or wrestles with God, depending on the interpretation. And at the end, he holds on as daybreak comes and he goes, I won't let go unless you give me a blessing. And he is blessed and left with a limp as he walks away to go reconcile with Esau. It's fascinating in that story. Esau has long forgiven his little brother and their childhood squabbles. Esau has forged a life of blessing for himself, his own families and lands. And here's Jacob putting his children and wives out front as a protective barrier just in case Esau's going to attack. His own insecurities still on display. There is reconciliation between the brothers. There's an assumption from Esau that they will see each other again soon. But it never really comes to bear. Jacob's insecurities are always present, but they do eventually find peace between them. Not a perfect future, but one without fighting. One of peace. The conflict in this story may not make sense to us. Blessings of a father are not binding in our world today. How many of you have ever gone to the bank to claim your inheritance and said, my father blessed me, so I get it all? It doesn't really work that way. Inheritance is often shared evenly, or sometimes there is none at this point in our culture in America, right? And can any of us imagine an adequate disguise to make someone think we're another family member? It's one of those parts of the story that reminds us these are as much parable to learn from as they are Israel's history. The conflict in this story may not make much sense to us, but let's be honest. How many of you have conflicts that make absolutely no sense to others? How many of our family squabbles make any sense to anyone else outside the family? How many of you have looked back on a conflict and said, why were we so entrenched? What were we arguing about? How did that make any sense to me, much less me explain it to others? Something happens. In our shared life, in our community of living together, in our relationships, something happens. We find ourselves irritated. We find ourselves misunderstood. We find ourselves hurt. Something happens. Then something else happens. And then something else happens. Till we find ourselves longing for peace. In the Jewish community, they use the word peace as a greeting, shalom. That Hebrew word is both a blessing when you welcome someone and also a blessing as you send someone out. It is a welcome and a sending. They use it every day. As you greet people, shalom, shalom. Greeting and sending out. They use it every day. It is integrated into their lives. It frames their relationships and interactions with others. Peace that frames our relationships, our interactions with others. And shalom is truly a word missing from the story today. Can you imagine Jacob and Esau beginning each of their interactions with, shalom, let me steal your blessing. Shalom, let me take what's yours. Shalom, let me pretend to be you instead of being myself. Can you imagine Isaac and Rebekah sitting down over the word shalom and then talking about their parenting styles and disagreements? It would be a good start, right? It would be a good start to resolving some of the conflict in this story. And maybe for us too, integrating shalom into our lives, framing our interactions with others with the word shalom. Imagine the cranky neighbor welcoming them with the word shalom before you voiced your concern about their tree or their dog. Imagine the supervisor at work beginning shalom before talking to you about how you might do something different. Imagine shalom being the greeting of a homeless person before we ask how we can help. Yes, simply wishing others peace could have made a world of difference in this story. But let's be honest, there were other issues too, right? There's some ingrained issues in this family. Fairness. One child born a few seconds after another doesn't get a share of a blessing? on. One parent dictates who's getting the family blessing? Really? In our story, Rebekah uses her power behind the scenes. Even if she welcomed Isaac into a conversation in Shalom, as a woman, she has no equal power in this situation. So she works for what she considers fairness as she can. She uses what power she has to work for justice, working through the conflict that's not being talked about, to work for what she hopes is a peace and just future. In our story, Jacob dares to break the rules, dares to be sneaky with a little mother encouragement, working for change in his future, trying to change a situation that he sees as unfair. If they'd not, the family might have lacked conflict. If they just let Isaac bless Esau, they might have lacked conflict. But would it have been peace? Not in the mind of Jacob. Not in the heart of Rebekah. Now, that's not to say that the outcome reflected Shalom by any means. This family is a mess. They are a mess. They have hurts to spare. They are a family desperately in need of counseling, of a family conversation, or at least some parenting classes, at the least. We can imagine a story where Isaac and Rebekah sit down and they talk about what type of parents they want to be, what values they want to pass on to their kids, not just a blessing. We can imagine Isaac and Rebekah saying, we're the people of God. We can do this differently than the culture around us. We have twin sons. We could do this differently. We can imagine that conversation. We can also imagine a version of the story where Jacob and Esau wish each other shalom and then sit down as brothers and sort out their differences. We can imagine a version of the story where they say, we came into this world together. Our futures are bound together. Let's work this out and be brothers. We can imagine these versions of the story that reflect Shalom because it's not our story. Let's be honest. This is much easier to see in somebody else's family mess, right? It's much easier to look into their lives and go, oh, look how you could sort all this out. Oh, me and my family, we're fine. Any conflicts? No, not to speak of. Any issues? No, not that we're going to deal with. Do you have peace? Mm-hmm. What do you mean by peace? It's so much easier to sort out others. It's harder to see the culmination of our choices and our experiences. It's harder to see the consequences of the power dynamics that we have grown up with. It's harder to see the way Shalom comes into our own hurts. The way Shalom speaks to our own hurt. How do we sort our mess? How do we sort through conflicts to find peace? How do we navigate through fairness and power to bring Shalom? There's no easy answer. In every family, every relationship, every community and workplace, every church family is different. But what if we entered every relationship with the blessing of Shalom? What if we entered each conversation with the blessing of Shalom? What if every decision we made started with a longing for peace? What if we framed our lives in peace and Shalom, in our coming and our going, our greeting and our departing, in our hurts and in our hopes? What if we framed Shalom, a living prayer around everything we did? Imagine the starting point, simply saying, peace be with you, and also with you. Imagine the starting place of simply walking into the chaos and saying, Shalom, like a prayer, but one that could be real. Shalom, peace, and the invitation to work for